Mold is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes excluded from the definition of hazardous materials or not included in the provision with regard to tenants' requirement, to maintain the premises absent of hazardous materials. Ultimately, if the language doesn't expressly obligate the tenant to remediate it, they're going to assume it's the landlord's responsibility. So it's important to flesh that out in that section or in another section.
This episode brought to you by Suites at Madison. Meeting and conference rooms for rent by the hour, week, month, or year. Suites at Madison, where business gets done. Check them out at www.downtowntampaoffice.com. Now, on to the show.
You are listening to the Invest Florida Real Estate Show, covering topics in lending, buy and sell strategies, property management, hot markets, and tips and tools to guide you along the way on your path to real estate success. You want Florida investment real estate talk? You have come to the right place. And now, our hosts, Eric Odom and Steven Silverman.
This is Lawfare. Today we have back with us again Rob Gidel, who is an attorney representing his clients in a wide range of real estate transactions. Rob has been on the show before, and we've adopted this term lawfare because it's real estate is war and it's law, and the object is to win the game. So, Rob, welcome back again to the Invest Florida show.
Thanks for having me.
Rob, we're going to talk about a subject near and dear to Florida landlords and tenants alike. Mold. It's pervasive. It's kind of like termites. There's two types of buildings, I think they say, with termites: that ones that have them in Florida and ones that are going to get them. It's kind of mold's the same.
And people regard mold, you might as well be saying the plague at the same time when you're talking about mold. That's how they think about it. But how is it affecting commercial leases, and what can people do about it to try and make their investments more secure?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Mold is oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes excluded from the definition of hazardous materials or not included in the provision with regard to tenants' requirement, to maintain the premises absent of hazardous materials. And one of the issues that I've tried to incorporate in leases that I would suggest landlords do is incorporate a concept that puts mold on the tenant to remediate and to maintain the premises without mold throughout the term of the lease. And I also have run up against the circumstances where this comes into play is when there's a continuous operation provision.
Let's back up a little bit, because investors that don't necessarily have experience with this is, oftentimes in industrial and more prevalent in industrial and other forms, asset classes, right, in terms of hazardous materials. They don't necessarily even understand the ramifications of that storage is one. I mean, I used to be a lender, and we had a guy who was taking medical waste and storing it in one of his units. And he did it under a fictitious name, and then he just walked away. Well, the stuff had been leaking out. There was radioactive stuff that he had.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Complete and utter disaster.
You had exciting clients.
Well, the banker, the borrower, the investor, the landlord, everybody has a part in this, right? You can't just say, well, someone else did the mess. Let them worry about it, right?
Correct.
So that's a landlord that's responsible for that. And so if mold is not listed as one of those items that's considered that the tenant should be cleaning up, obviously with the situation I'm discussing about, or the anecdote that I brought up about the storage, there's no way anybody can do anything about that. He's gone. Like, that guy was putting stuff in there and he's under fictitious names. No way to find him. But some of these tenants, they have deep balance sheets. And so, you want to make sure that you're covered on this situation. So anyway, I just want to kind of set the table a little bit. Mold is one of those that are outside. Of course, people talk about, benzene and gasoline and all these other sorts of hazardous materials, but mold, the law, you said, doesn't see it as necessarily as hazardous.
So the tenants are not responsible to clean up mold if it appears.
And why would they even be responsible?
So in certain circumstances, the definition of hazardous materials, because, that, as you can imagine, that's been an expansive area of the law. environmental law as to whether or not certain things are an environmental issue or they're not. And ultimately, if the language doesn't expressly obligate the tenant to remediate it, they're going to assume it's the landlord's responsibility. So it's important to flesh that out in that section or in another section. But where this really comes into play, putting it all together, is the obligations for the tenant to continuously operate. A lot of really high net worth tenants will say, I want the ability to go dark. I shouldn't have to continuously operate in the premises. And so if I
this
operate
happens a lot in retail.
It happens a lot in retail.
It happens a lot of retail.
And even if they decide to leave the space, technically we're not in default because of our lease. Our lease says so long as we're paying rent. But if you don't have a provision in the lease that obligates them to continuously operate and run the HVAC, you're going to get mold. So this is where it comes up in Florida. Period.
Yeah. And mold will keep growing. So you're really bringing down the value of your investment by not having a clause or covering yourself with a clause like that.
But that's a foreign concept. You won't see that in any standard lease form with a landlord. And it's something that people need to think about, because particularly if your provisions with respect to default or going dark don't have an obligation on the part of the tenant to continuously operate their HVAC, you're going to have mold.
Yeah, you have situations on the retail side where somebody bought a triple net, single tenant building. The owner might be 500 miles away, can't go over there all the time. That's fairly typical. And that little leak in the roof, air conditioning not being run, power shut off, and you've got a deep-pocketed tenant paying your rent, so you sleep on it a little bit. But then doesn't take much to come back, and a year later, and all the drywall is destroyed, the HVAC system, everything that mold's going to attach to is now attached, and it can be extraordinarily expensive to remediate that.
Absolutely. It changes the underwriting of every deal at that point.
Well, I guess that's an interesting point for our investors to keep track of. Just watch the mold, because mold is part of Florida investing.
And guys, that's the point of Lawfare. We want to do quick hitting podcasts, give you a couple pointers on what's what with legal world and real estate. So we appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Speaking as a Florida lawyer, so talking in general terms, every situation is unique. Facts and circumstances always seek the expertise of a licensed attorney on these issues.
You've just listened to the Invest Florida podcast with Eric Odom and Steven Silverman. Join us every week for actionable real estate investment ideas, and of course, visit our website at www.investfloridashow.com for more shows and tips on how to earn a cash flow in the real estate market in Florida. While hosts and producers of the Invest Florida show have no reason to doubt the validity of comments of our guests, we do not warranty their accuracy. Please check with your legal, financial, and tax advisors before entering into any investment. Returns will vary from person to person and deal to deal based on unique circumstances. All information expressed in this show is for educational purposes only. Opinions of the guests are not necessarily shared by the hosts and producers of the Invest Florida show.